Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to the third session in our CWSRF funding process virtual workshop series on why small communities should consider CWSRF funding. My name is Kristen Crew from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few logistics and then we can get started. During the webinar today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information that you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This webinar has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for the session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. Now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I will be sharing shortly in the chat. I would like to introduce our presenter today, Mike Tate, engineer and project associate with the Wichita State University Environmental Finance Center. But before I hand it over to him, I would like every one of you to fill out this poll for me right quick. Where are you employed? All right, go ahead and get your answers in. I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. All right, and it looks like the majority of you are in state or the federal government, local government, or consulting. There's also a 27% that are in other. And on that note, Mike, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Okay, Kristen, I'm not seeing, yeah, maybe that's it. Here's the sharing. Okay, hopefully everybody can see my screen on what we're gonna talk about today as an overview, and real quickly tell you just briefly about me so you understand maybe where I'm coming from and perhaps some of my small biases in terms of the clean water SRF. But I formerly, before I retired, worked for the Kansas Department of Health and Environment for about 31 years. Retired there as the director of the water programs, and then worked for EPA for another 6 years before I retired there, and now I'm serving as program associate with the Wichita State University Environmental Finance Center. And I told Kristen before we started, we should have another poll is, are you concurrently watching the tip-off of the first game of the first round of March Madness right now? But we'll not ask that and not put anybody on the spot for that. But we'll get started here with kind of what I wanted to talk about, which is the Clean Water SRF and why it may be a good source of funding for small communities. But first, kind of give a little background on the whole big picture here and how it all ties together, and hopefully it'll come together for you well in the end. But first, I want to talk about why we collect and treat wastewater. Why is it so expensive? How do we generally fund it, with the Clean Water State Revolving Fund being one of the options for funding, and then briefly how that CWSRF works and pros and cons of using it. And then if you think it's right for you, maybe what you want to do to prepare and be ready, and then kind of the steps you can expect in the process. So first, why do we collect and treat wastewater? It's always really important to know and go over this, but the real reasons are we need to protect human health. We reduce pathogens and toxins that go out in the environment so that we protect humans' health. We protect the environment also by reducing toxins, minimize organic matter that goes out in water so we maintain the proper DO, dissolved oxygen, and support aquatic life. We minimize groundwater contamination. And what's really becoming important, just more so all the time, is reclaiming the water. We don't want to waste it. Wastewater, really, while people think of it as, I used to have a guy I worked with called it lumpy water. It's really only about 0.1% solids, and the rest of it's just water. So we ought to reclaim it and reuse it for other purposes, particularly with some of the drought conditions and those types of things and overuse that we get into today. And some that you may not think of often, but it really does enhance recreation, fishing, swimming, skiing, what have you, anything you do in and on the water. And one that I know a lot of people don't consider, but really is shown to be quite valuable, is that it increases property value if you have good, clean water. But what do we often hear when we talk about that? And what I used to hear a lot was the government's making me do it, or EPA's making me do it, or the state's making me do it. And people kind of default to that sometimes, I think, because infrastructure is not cheap. You got to pay for building it, you got to pay for maintaining it. And sometimes you just don't want to go to the ratepayers and say, this is really needed. But I would always say we need to go back and tell people, yes, it's costing more, but the real reason is we're trying to improve humans' health and we're trying to improve the environment. And that's the real reason for treating wastewater and why we have to spend money to do that. So the Clean Water State Revolving Fund is a source of funding that can help mitigate particularly that capital cost. It's not really there to pay for operating costs, but it can help mitigate or reduce those capital costs that are involved with that infrastructure. And so it is expensive. And why is that? Well, when we're talking about small communities, economy of scale is a huge factor in terms of the cost of infrastructure. It's very people intensive to construct a project, both in terms of labor for building it and the engineering component of it. And engineering costs can be anywhere from 5 to 30% of a project, depending on how big the project is, what kind of a scale it is. And if you look at this graph over here, this came out of a report from Utah, where they were looking at the costs of upgrading to do nutrient reductions at their facilities. And it's a little bit dated, but from 2010. But what I want you to see here, along with my kind of poorly drawn line, is the concept of economy of scale. When we look here at below 10 million gallons a day of treatment, when you get below that, the costs radically rise. Okay, it's disproportionate, and that's what that term economy of scale means. The bigger you get, the cheaper it is to treat per gallon of wastewater. And so when you get down here to where we're talking about with a lot of small communities, you know, less than 1 million gallons a day, you can see the costs can be anywhere from 2, 3 to 5 times as much for that treating 1 gallon of water as it is for a larger facility. There's also construction material costs that go into that, and those include stainless steel particularly. Remember, we're working in a corrosive environment when we're talking about wastewater, so you have to have things that resist rust and oxidation. So you get a lot of stainless steel in a plant, you get aluminum in a plant that won't corrode, a lot of concrete, and a lot of that concrete needs to have special coatings on it to protect it and extend its life. You've got mechanical equipment that's going into that plant typically that adds to the cost. You're doing a lot of below ground work, you know, sewers and things come in below grade, and that's always more expensive when you have to dig and excavate and get down there to work. And it's also a much more dangerous environment to work in. And then a lot of instrumentation. Those of you who work in a plant know that there's more and more instrumentation being added to these plants all the time. So what are the typical funding options that we see when we're talking about wastewater infrastructure? Well, there could be community reserve funds. We call that money in the bank. And that may be money you have. And you should have enough on hand in a reserve fund for your infrastructure, you know, to do repair and replacement of parts like pumps and valves, seals, what have you, on your wastewater plant. But I would say if you have enough money in the bank for a major capital project, you know, a replacement or a big upgrade, you've probably been overcharging your residents, and they may not be too happy about that. But it can be there to help defray costs of a larger capital project, but generally there's not enough there to pay for something large. The community can issue debt. That had been probably a little more popular in the past than it is now. And that's often in the form of bonds, some type of revenue bonds that the city would issue to raise money and then pay back the bondholders over time at an interest rate where you purchase the bonds. Again, not as prevalent today as it used to be in small communities, but larger communities still often undertake bond sales in order to fund their infrastructure projects. And there's a lot to that I'll get into later as to why that is, but it's just typically they have enough staff to follow the process and to oversee it and to make it work. There are also some foundation grants out there to help communities. I wouldn't necessarily count on that as always being available. The foundations generally have some type of idea in mind as to the types of communities that they would like to give those grants to. And those are typically things like disadvantaged communities where that would be the case. There's also rural development. I'm sure there's people on this webinar who have worked through the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Development Group in terms of their water and wastewater loan program. But for that, you have to meet some specific requirements to be eligible. You got to show you can't obtain commercial credit on reasonable terms, that you're a state or local government entity, a nonprofit, recognized tribe, and you're at a population of less than 10,000. And their funding is usually what they state is typically at a ratio of about 4-to-1 loan to grant money. And then housing and urban development has community development block grants, often heard referred to as CDBG. And those grants are administered by states for populations of less than 50,000. So they would be administered typically for the smaller size communities that we're talking about. But the state sets some of the requirements on that. Federal government sets some of the requirements on the use of that money. And it really has to be used to benefit low and or moderate income individuals in a town. So if you have a town with a number of low and moderate income individuals, you may qualify for that. And then states put restrictions on that money as to how they use it. As I said, that I worked for the state of Kansas in my previous career. And as an example there, they restrict that money to communities that are under an order from the state NPDES permitting authority, that have an order that says you have to do something in order to comply with your permit. And then lastly, what we're going to really talk about today is the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund. And that is really the biggest source of funding out there today for wastewater in terms of the numbers of facilities using it. And so just to kind of briefly talk about it and how it works, we got to understand how the funds are derived. How does the money get to those state funding programs? So EPA provides funds to all the states. It's called a capitalization grant that infuses money into their program. And that amount differs by state. It's based on a funding formula. And after to get that capitalization grants, then states have to provide a 20% match for those federal funds. So state has to come up with 20% of the federal money in order to match it and get the funds. And a lot of times states will sell bonds in order to make that 20% match. Some states, I think the latest data I could find said there's 28 of them that leverage their Clean Water State Revolving Funds to increase the amount of available loan. And I'll talk about leveraging later, so you may understand a little bit about what's going on there. And then how do you identify projects that get this money? Well, the states will solicit projects from eligible, public entities, municipalities, groups of municipalities, interstates, state agencies, as to projects that they need to undertake. A lot of states will also kind of call and talk and discuss with certain municipalities that they think they need to be looking at some type of upgrade to their facility, and will encourage them to develop a project to get state revolving fund money. And then once the projects are identified, they're placed on a project priority list, and those are included in what's called a state's intended use plan, or you'll hear people generally refer to that as the IUP. So how does that Clean Water SRF work? Well, it issues below market rate loans and provides some grant money. It's depending on the state as to what the ratio of loan to grant is, and differ from state to state as to how they go about doing that. Again, funded by a combination of state and federal monies, and that CAP grant before I told you was based on a formula. Well, each state gets a minimum of 0.5% of the federal allocation for the CWSRF, and then additional funding based on needs and population factors from the federal government. And then again, the states match that with that 20% capitalization money. And then they have revolved money. It's called the State Revolving Fund. So how does that work? Well, you loan out money to somebody and you have an interest rate on it. Once they pay all that money back, that it builds up a larger pool of money to be loaned into the future. You'll also sometimes hear that referred to as recycled money. It's revolved money. And the idea then is that you'll perpetuate that state loan fund over time, that that will always continue to grow and have money to loan out in perpetuity, into the future. Now, I said that there's this concept of leveraging out there, leveraging money, and about 28 states currently leverage money. So what do I mean by leveraging? Well, if you can think of the SRF program as the lever out here, and you can take a little bit of money and generate a lot of money out of it in order to loan to people. You say, well, how do you go about doing that? Well, what the states do is they will sell bonds, and those bonds will be backed by the fact that they have CWSRF assets out there, which are the federal monies, the state monies, the recycled money, that revolved money that comes back into the fund. So they go out and say, look, we want to sell bonds, and we think we can back those up by the fact we have all this other money out there, and we have willing communities who want to borrow the money and they'll pay it back. So when the states sell those bonds to generate more money, they have to charge enough of an interest rate on the loan in order to pay those bonds back. Okay, so they can't go out and sell bonds and then turn around and make that grant money, because then there's nobody available to pay that money back, and you would default, of course, on the bond. So sometimes when you're dealing with states who are leveraging, and particularly leveraging large amounts, it can limit the amount of money they have available for grants or for this principal forgiveness, because you can't have rates that are less than the bond yield that they have to pay back at the end of the bond's term. The good thing about those leveraging programs that the states have, though, is that their bonds generally have excellent ratings. If you hear of, bond ratings for people being AAA, most of those state programs can access AAA bonds. And when you have the highest rated bonds, it means you get the lowest interest rate on those bonds. So the states in borrowing money can generally borrow it at the lowest rates possible. So what that amounts to then is, if we look at this, we have, the total source of funds being the CAP grant, the capitalization grant, the state match, you got the revolved money, and you've got the leveraged money. I'll put a dashed line around that because, again, not every state leverages, but a lot of states do. And just to give you an idea of being able to leverage, this is a graph that came out of the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection's 2021 annual report. And all of these states with SRFs will produce these annual reports. They won't all have exactly the same information. But I found this interesting because it said that when they looked at the clean water borrower credit ratings, and you'll notice that almost all of them are this AA, which is a pretty good rating. A few of them get the AAA, but they also state in their report that the bonds they sell to leverage at the state of Connecticut are all AAA bonds. So they should get a little bit better rate than the people going out on the open market themselves could get in terms of interest rate. And if you want to look at it in terms of, the size of these circles here are kind of indicative of the size of the amount of money that goes into a state's SRF program. And nationally, EPA estimates that about 31% is federal funds, okay? So capitalization grant up here is going to be a pretty good sized circle, at least a third of the money. And then the remainder is state match, which is considerably less. And then you got loan payments, which hopefully is about as big or should be bigger ultimately than the capitalization grant. And then if you leverage, again, with the dotted line, because not everybody does, it can be a tremendously large amount of money that states have out there to loan. And so the bottom line of all of this is EPA estimates that for each federal dollar spent, 31% there, that you get greater than $3 of assistance at the local communities because of all of these other sources of money that are out there. So it's looked at as being a pretty good investment nationally for the federal government to put that money into clean water infrastructure. Now, I told you I worked at Kansas. I pulled this out of their 2021 annual report just to give you an idea of where that money comes from in the Kansas program, which has been around for, I think it's approaching 30 years. But if you look at all their sources of money, you see the capitalization grant, that federal money is about 29%. Remember, we said nationally it was about 31%. State match, smaller piece of the pie, as we discussed earlier. And then those revolved funds are just about the same as the capitalization grant. So as the thing's gone on, it's built up and built those revolved funds there to be reloaned again. And then lastly, you've got the leveraged money. And this is Kansas is a state that leverages, and that's about 37% of their funds. So that's why I say that if you do leveraging in these states, it can turn into quite a large amount of money to be used for funding projects. So you can see that breakdown. And so in this case, it is a pretty good investment for the federal government. In this case, 29% of the money going into the fund. Then you get another, 71% coming from other sources. So with all of that and a little bit of how it works and why we need to build infrastructure, it's why should small communities particularly consider the Clean Water State Revolving Fund? Well, I'll give you the pros and the cons. And, spoiler alert, the pros are a lot more, there's a lot more of them, I think, than the cons. And they generally outweigh any negatives associated with the program. But I know some people might disagree with me, but I think it's a pretty simple application process. Most of the states will help you through the application process for that money. And I think you generally find it a little simpler than trying to go borrow money commercially to do these kinds of things. The city doesn't have to issue bonds. I'll explain a little bit about that here in a minute. You can get the money at low interest rates. You have the potential for what are called additional subsidies, and those may be in the form of this principal forgiveness or a grant, or other options that those states have to reduce either your loan repayment or reduce your loan rate. You have the potential for planning and design grants. Most states will have some type of part of their program where they may allow for planning grants you could get, or a design grant to design a facility once you've identified it and have an engineer on board. And generally, there's no minimum limit to the amount of money you can borrow. I'll give you some examples here near the end where there's been some very small loans made. And sometimes when you're working with commercial lenders, a loan can get too small for them to effectively make any money, to make it pay off for making such a small loan. And then on the flip side of that, I'd add that if a state is leveraging, they can also loan some very large amounts of money. And I'll give you an example of one of those here in a bit. And the next one is the state SRF agencies often work with other funders to minimize cost. You know, there's probably some out there, but I have not run across a state that doesn't get together and discuss projects with their state rural development agency and their state community development block grant agency. And they will get together and try to figure out how they can put together the best funding package for a particular city to help minimize the cost of their project, which when you lower costs means you lower rates to the ratepayers, and everybody likes that. You know, everybody comes out a winner on that deal when you get efficient funding. And lastly, I'll explain this when all the cool kids are doing it. And you'll see what I mean here in a few minutes about that. Now, there are some cons to it, just a couple, and you can even argue that some of the cons are not really cons, but you will have arguments on that as to whether they are or not. But there's strings attached to taking the federal money. And that is you have to pay Davis-Bacon wages, and that's the prevailing wage in the particular area. I'll explain a little bit more about that later. There's Buy American provisions, which, you know, sounds good, and it is, and fully want to support, you know, American manufacturers and all, but sometimes you just can't get what you need. And so you have to seek waivers and those types of things to perhaps get project or products that are built overseas or have a large number of components in them that are built overseas. The terms of the loan may be shorter on some of the state clean water SRF. And when you shorten a loan, you know, that what happens is you have higher payments, you know, every year. So some states only allow a 20-year maximum state revolving fund loan. Others do a 30. There's other loan programs out there like rural development that offer 40-year loans. And so when you take that longer loan, you get a lower periodic payment, which can help you lower what you have to charge in terms of rates to your users of that system. But what you want to be real careful of is, does your infrastructure last for 40 years? And you should structure your loan such that you're identifying things that wear out sooner than 40 years, and then those things that last 40 years, and setting your payment schedule up accordingly so you're able to maintain and replace equipment as it's going to wear out in the shorter term. So let's start looking at the pros in more detail. And again, I said I think it's a simple application process for most states, and I know they're striving to make it even easier. A lot of them will let you apply online. Others, you know, still may have paper applications, but they've got staff there to assist you in terms of filling out the loan application process, and they can really help kind of walk you through the process. The next pro I'd given you was that the community doesn't have to issue bonds, and bonds can be pretty complicated, I think, and be a little overwhelming for a small community. And what happens in the bond issuing process is, if you're a city here, you're typically going to hire a municipal advisor who's going to work with you on issuing bonds. They're going to work with an underwriter. The underwriter's going to have its attorney. You're going to have a bond counsel who's going to advise, you know, that the bonds are issued appropriately and that they can be done. The underwriter has to have a trustee to pay out the bondholders, to pay them their interest on that particular bond. The underwriter may use a feasibility consultant to see if it's really feasible to issue those bonds. Of course, you're going to have your rating agency, the ones that give you those AAA bonds versus BBB bonds, and all those types of things. And you got one that's called a credit enhancer. You know, may be able to make a bond look more attractive to buyers if you buy insurance on it, to offer them. So my point is that all of these people are going to get paid, and somebody has to keep track of all of that. And so typically in a smaller city, that's tough to do. It really is. A larger city that has a more dedicated financial department, multiple staff who might be able to oversee those, who typically issue bonds for other types of activities in towns, may feel more comfortable doing that. But it can be a chore for a smaller community. And then there's low interest rates. They're always, the loans that I've seen are always below private market rate. And EPA says nationally they've been around 1% in terms of the loan rates. But you got to remember, again, I've got to keep bringing up that if a state leverages so they can get more money out there to be loaned, the rate may be just a little bit higher in order to cover those bond rates that they have to pay. Again, pros, there's possibility of additional subsidies to reduce some of the borrower's costs. And these subsidies are generally in the form of principal forgiveness or a grant. And typically you'll find it in terms of principal forgiveness. And the reason this principal forgiveness is used, that if states did it as a grant to a person, there are certain additional strings and reporting that has to go in if money is given as a grant, whereas this principal forgiveness, the state can say, okay, we made the loan, it's $1 million, we're going to forgive 250,000 of it, so now you really owe us 750,000. So essentially, it kind of works the same as a grant, but provides a different, easier way, I think, to provide you that subsidization on that particular loan. Now, states generally aim to give principal forgiveness to lower income communities, disadvantaged communities, very small communities where there's a high cost of infrastructure to the population that's there to pay it. You'll also hear that referred to as a high burden to those particular communities. And the Clean Water SRF has a built-in mechanism for providing those subsidies. And, you know, they're required and have been required for a number of years to have a minimum of 10% of the capitalization grant be used for principal forgiveness. And then there's a maximum of 30% principal forgiveness. Now, what I think a lot of people have heard about, and what has really, I think, got people excited out there, is the bipartisan infrastructure law. And it requires that 49% of the federal funds that go into that must be used as principal forgiveness. So that really kind of ups the ante, that if you're a community that qualifies, there may be more subsidization out there, at least for the next 5 years or so, than there is typically. And I think there's going to be an entire webinar devoted to the bipartisan infrastructure law. So that'd really be a good one to listen to when it comes up. But while it's 49% of the federal funds got to be used for that, it doesn't necessarily mean that forgiveness will be 49% for each eligible projects. States could give greater than 49% for a particular project in special certain circumstances, or they may wish to spread that forgiveness to more communities and so limit it to 49% or less. I think it's as long as that total of 49% of the federal capitalization money goes to principal forgiveness, that meets the requirements of the law. There's the potential, again, for design grants. Many states allow planning and design grants, allow planning grants to identify project needs and options. Some will offer those also to assist in engineering project design. Again, it's up to that particular state, so you have to work with them. Again, generally no limit. I've seen loans as small as $40,000 to do a pump station upgrade. And sometimes, like I said before, that might not be cost effective for a commercial lender to do that small a loan. But it's doable through the Clean Water SRF. And I'd also say, again, flip side, if a state is leveraging, they can also loan very large amounts of money. And Connecticut identified that they have given an over $250 million loan through the SRF. You get into some of these larger communities that have combined sewer issues, it's very expensive. People are talking in the billions of dollars in order to correct those combined sewer issues. So if they choose to go the SRF route, it takes a considerable amount of money. And again, then those state agencies work with other funders to minimize costs. And they generally have I've found a good working relationship. They all want to see that they can get the most cost-effective funding package out to those communities to ensure that their ratepayers are paying, the lowest possible rate to still support the infrastructure that they need. Okay, when I said all the cool kids are doing it, here's the reason. This is what I mean by that small communities utilize the Clean Water SRF more than anybody else. Been over 30,000 loans to those small communities, and by that we mean less than 10,000. And so you can see here nearly 2/3 of all the Clean Water SRF loans have gone to small communities, where 1/3 have gone to large. Pretty typical. What you see though in these types of things, when you look at the amount of dollars that are loaned though, while it's 67% of the loans that have gone out, it's about 23% of the money. And that just goes to show that there's a lot of small communities that have projects that don't cost a lot. They don't cost a lot in terms of what we see in some infrastructure projects, but they cost a lot based on the number of people in town who are there as ratepayers to pay those off. So it's not as if small communities are getting shortchanged because 3/4 of the money goes to large communities. It's just they don't need as large a loan as those communities. So there are a lot of people using it, and it has worked well for them. Although I will say that talking to some states, they're seeing a lot more interest from larger communities in the SRF. So the cons to that, I said there were some string attached, the Davis-Bacon Act wages and federally funded projects, and that includes the Clean Water SRF, because of that federal capitalization grant, have to pay what's called the prevailing wage in the area. And those wages may be higher than are typically paid, particularly in rural areas or in states that don't have these prevailing wage laws. The required paperwork can increase costs. The contractors are required to do more federal reporting to show that they are paying those prevailing wages in the areas. Some contractors have complained to me they have to keep 2 sets of books. They have some employees who are being paid that Davis-Bacon Act wage and some who are being paid local wages. And so they got to separate projects that are done with federal funds and without federal funds. But I think they've figured out ways to do that. And so some of them, particularly the contractors, argue the funds could be better spent on projects than complying with Davis-Bacon Act. But on the flip side of that, there are people who argue that without Davis-Bacon, you're going to get less skilled workers and you're going to get lower quality construction. So I'll let those arguments simmer on their own and not weigh in on it. But some people do identify it as a drawback. And then there's Buy America provisions. And, I'm all for supporting American industry. Sometimes the products, though, can be a little more expensive. I think we all know that, wages in the US are higher than other places, so the products that are produced can sometimes be a little more expensive. There's some international technology that's superior. There's really good work on wastewater and some of the technology coming out of the Netherlands, Austria, South Africa, that is quite good. And so people would like to use that, but they may not be able to if they're taking federal money for the project. And then there's always complaints about the difficulty in acquiring waivers. You can get waivers for some of these Buy American provisions and getting guidance. In fact, I think it's the bill guides the latest Buy America, Build America. The actual final guidance for that, the comment period just ended this week. So kind of into the projects without, the finalized guidance yet, but that's had to move very fast. So I'm sure that'll be forthcoming. The other con was the loan term thing, was that, 20 years max, whereas you can get some 40-year loans other places. Here's just an example of a $1 million loan. So you borrow $1 million. One of them's at 20 years, one of them's at 40 years. Interest rates 2% for each of them. It's like, okay, so you're paying back almost $61,000 a year. On 20 years, you're only paying back $36,400, say, then for that 40-year loan. So you can make lower payments, and that typically equates into lower user rates, which people like. For both of them, you're going to pay the principal back of $1 million, but you're going to pay, $214,000 in interest for 20 years. You're going to pay $453,000 in interest, $453,000 in interest on the 40-year loan. So overall, the cost of that 40-year loan is more in the long run, even though you are able to make those lower interest. And for most communities, I'd say, when you weigh, as I told you, my spoiler alert at the front, the pros generally outweigh the cons, particularly in small communities. It makes it fairly easy for them to access below market funding for their projects, and it gives that potential for added subsidy to reduce the rates and reduce the loan amount that has to be paid. You've got state organizations there to help you with the application process and to help bundle funding to give you some cost-effective solutions. Now, large cities with a strong financial position may find that it's a little easier to sell bonds if they think there's drawbacks with the SRF, so that's good for them. And if they can do it and they got good bond ratings, they can get low interest rates. That's if interest rates are relatively low. So here's one thing I wanted to show you, and it's kind of two things, is notice this green line are AA bonds. That's a better rated bond. And this is BAA bonds, which are not as highly rated. So you can see that spread in interest rate. The better your rating, the lower your interest rate. But what I wanted to point out is here over time, up until about last year, when inflation went way up, bond rates also went way up. So larger cities who, used to say, it's just too much hassle to go to the SRF, are now becoming a lot more interested in perhaps utilizing SRF. And the reason for that is talked to Kansas, and last week, their rate was 2.14%, for a 20-year loan. You look at this, let's say the rate's 4%, which is somewhere in between those bunch of bonds. You're going to be making a much larger annual payment. You're going to pay about $250,000 more in interest in order to pay off that loan. So when you start to get that big spread in interest rates, larger cities may think it's better to go with the SRF and comply with those requirements like Davis-Bacon and Build America, Buy America than it is to try to go it on their own. And I think with that, Kristen, we've got the next question.
All right, I am going to launch the second poll. Are you considering being involved with a CWSRF funded project as a borrower, consultant, regulator, or other? And I'll be closing this poll in just a couple of seconds, so go ahead and get your answers in. All right, it looks like most people are considering being involved.
That's good to hear. A lot of infrastructure out there that needs to be improved. Okay, so that's good to hear that you're thinking about doing that. And so if you are, here's some things you ought to look forward to, and we'll talk about the process just briefly. But it's always good to do some capital improvement planning, regardless of how big or little you are. You need to have some idea of what you need and when you may need it, and keep that information handy, even if it's rough estimates. And sometimes talk to your state NPDES regulator about potential future requirements that might be there too, so you can be thinking about how those might have to factor into the future. Work with an engineer to assess your infrastructure and estimate costs. And again, I'd say your state inspector, or there's technical service providers out there who can maybe help identify needs, things that they see in the system that need to be improved or are in need of some replacement. Assess the potential rate impact. What are your users have to pay in order to make these improvements, and can they afford it? And if they can't, is there subsidization out there? And regardless of if, it may say they can afford it or not, there may still be some subsidization out there to help them keep those rates in check for your users. Work with your state SRF agency. Like I say, everyone can be a little bit different in what they need, but you can find out first from them if you're going to qualify for the funding, qualify for additional subsidization, or you a disadvantaged community or have affordability issues. Do they have planning or design money available, and can they help you work through some other funding mechanisms to help bundle with the CWSRF? And then you need to get on your state's IUP and develop your project information. And ultimately, that's going to be plans and specifications and cost estimates. Then what you do is do what they call pre-loan requirements, and you have to do an environmental assessment, make sure that what you're planning really has any issues with some of the impacts of that project, and submit plans and specs. You have a public hearing to provide the community input on what plan you've looked at and alternatives you've reviewed and alternative sources of funding that you've looked at. And when everybody's good with that, then you can apply for the loan. And that's that formal submittal to the agency. And a state will determine whether or not to approve that, and they'll look at your financial capacity to repay the loan and to operate and maintain the proposed infrastructure. The state will determine the size of the loan and additional subsidization for you, and provide you the terms of repayment, which generally doesn't start until after the project is finished. So then the next step is just constructing the project. Make sure that you've got your permits in order, from any kind of construction permits needed to your NPDES permit if you're a discharger, or a state wastewater permit if you don't discharge, any local permits, bid the project and build it. And then at the end of it, you close out the project. It's up to you as the city, generally in conjunction with your engineer, to accept the construction and as-built plans for the facility, They should prepare an operation and maintenance manual for you that you need to accept. You pay all the change orders and everything that's come up at the end of the project. You make the contractor generally going to make the certifications that they've done Buy American and they've done labor properly and provide all of that. And then the state will issue you a loan repayment schedule. So that can sometimes seem a bit overwhelming. It probably looks like it laid out in that, but it's a pretty structured process. And there's help out there available. Here's the 3 EFCs who are working on the SRF set of webinars that you could contact, and if they can't help you directly, they know the contacts to help get you in touch with people who can help work you through the process. But the last thing I want to say is that it's a great option for most communities, and I'd say particularly small communities. I told you I'd show you some of these loan amounts that have been done out in the past. $24,000 loan, a $32,000. And I won't say that this is for a whole project. This may just be a piece of it. This just may be paying engineering fees, and some other source of funding was used for another part of the project. But it does just show that these pretty small communities here can get a small loan, or probably a little bit larger loan for the size of their community in order to help build infrastructure. And like I say, it's often combined with other funding for the most effective, cost-effective wastewater improvements. But the bottom line on all of it is that it's up to you to communicate with your state clean water SRF agency to get things started. And I think they're very happy to hear from you and help you get started in the process, because ultimately their goal is to produce good effluent, clean water that helps everyone. So with that, thanks for attending today and take any questions.
All right, Mike. So we've had a couple of questions come in. I'm going to go ahead and just read them to you and have you answer. So Paul says, as a former state employee and now consultant, there are many states struggling with on-site waste systems like septic or cesspools. While CWSRF allows decentralized funding, the establishment of these programs is at the state level. Is there any federal support or momentum generated in DC that would encourage or incentivize the decentralized program establishment?
I'm not aware of that specifically. However, I think there is through the bill monies looking at disadvantaged communities, and quite often those on-site distributed systems come with communities who are disadvantaged, and so there may be some more opportunities there, I think, to address that with this latest iteration of the bipartisan infrastructure law.
Great. And then the next question is, do states set the maximum term on the loan based on the life expectancy of the infrastructure being constructed?
No. Generally, states have a fixed time period for their loans. In fact, Kansas, where I worked, is right now trying to get, it was in law that they were 20-year loans, and they're trying to get the legislature to up that to 30. What you can do, though, in terms of looking at your repayment is, and your engineers are generally pretty good at this, is looking at things that may have to be replaced sooner than that term of the loan, and actually then get your payment going up more rapidly than that, so that you'll have funding there to do repair and replace prior to the end of the loan. So it gets to be a little more complicated calculation in order to set your monthly payments and to do your rate payments, but that can certainly be done to make sure that you're not, you know, if it's like on an automobile, people would say you're upside down if your infrastructure is worth less than what you still owed on it. So there are ways to address that and recoup those monies.
Okay. And then Ellen says she appreciates the comparison of debt financing options, but are you able to comment on when debt financing is not a good option for a small system?
Debt. You know, I would say what I hate to see is if it's just something small that you need to do, where you could maybe, you know, increase rates and look at a increased rate over a certain horizon in order to do some, you know, minor project work. But it's pretty difficult on these large upgrades or replacements or repairs to not incur some kind of debt in order to build those. It's just like, you know, I would say it's a lot like owning a car. You know, hopefully you keep enough money, you know, in the bank that you can do car repairs and sometimes maybe have a major repair like a manifold gasket or something you have to replace. But if you got to go buy a new car, not too many people have, you know, that money in the bank to go out and buy it. You've got to incur some kind of debt in order to undertake that larger capital project.
And the next question is CWSRF available for potable water as well?
There's some semantics there, yes, but it's not called CWSRF. It's called the DWSRF, which is the drinking water SRF. And so, yes, that is out there also. And it has some even little slightly different tweaks and things to it than the CWSRF. But yes, it's certainly out there as well. And you'll find in a lot of the state agencies, it's the same group of people who are working on both of those.
All right. And then we also got asked if there are any loans, funds, or grants available for small privately owned wastewater systems.
Not that I'm aware of. No. There are some things, and I'd say you really need to talk to your state about that. There may be some things if you're in the just outside of a city, or you're in a city, but you still have this privately owned system. There may be some ways to deal with that to get you hooked to a larger system that may be fundable through SRF, but those are all real specific, and you really need to talk to the state agency about whether or not something like that is eligible.
All right, and I've got just 2 more questions for you, okay, Mike?
Okay.
So has the EPA
as long as we get started, before the Jayhawks tip off at 1.
Okay.
So.
We'll do what we can. Has the EPA developed new affordability criteria? The only criteria I've come across is the 2.5% wastewater and the 2% water, or 4.5% combined as a percentage of MHI. Despite the amount of funding available, cost of construction has increased over the last decade. I'm curious if there are any new studies or planned studies to identify affordability metrics.
Actually, the states have developed typically those affordability metrics when it comes to the SRF funding part of it. People continue to look at the affordability question, but it really seems to be a tough one for people to bite off on. And, you know, I would say be real cautious, particularly on this wastewater side. People tend to use the 2% as an affordability number. And if you'll look at it's a 1994 EPA's economic guidance document for compliance with water quality standards, I think is the name, or close to that. 2% is kind of thrown out there, but there are mitigating factors. If you go through and look at a lot of other tests, that document will tell you for some people, 1% is about it. For some people, it might be 1.5%, and then kind of up to 2%. And then it's like, I think it's over 2.5%. It's generally not thought to be affordable for just about anybody. So no, that document's still out there, but be real careful how you use it, because it's not just 2%. And particularly with a lot of these small communities we're talking about and some of the struggles that they have, it may be more like a 1 to 1.5% is the affordability cutoff.
All right, and then the last question for you, if your state doesn't offer funding for preliminary engineering planning and design services, are there resources available nationwide to help communities fund that service? Small communities are hesitant to pay for engineering planning and design if it does not guarantee that they will be approved for PF or subsidized loan.
I gotta say, I'm not aware of any. I think, again, there may be some things out there like some foundations. Some of the states may, fund it out of their own funding from other sources, I'd put it. So you can talk to your state, but overall, I'm not aware of a national program that, say, has a cadre of engineers who go out and do that kind of work.
Great. All right. Well, we'll let you go, Mike. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. For all of you following this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email with the slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following the webinar so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on topics that are important to you. Thank you again, and we hope to see you at future EFCN events.